The hum of the engines was steady, the air inside the cabin thick with recycled oxygen. Dr. Aisha Taylor stared out the window, her gaze unfocused as the vast stretch of blue and green beneath her blurred into the horizon. She barely noticed the flight attendants moving through the aisles, the soft clink of beverage carts, or the distant chatter of passengers. Her mind was somewhere far away, tethered to the memories of a life she had lost. Her 9-year-old daughter, Lena, was doodling in her sketchbook beside her, blissfully unaware of the weight that pressed on her mother's heart. Her 14-year-old son, Jamal, sat with his headphones on, his attention swallowed by the glow of his phone screen. Aisha had hoped that this trip, away from the ghosts of Chicago, might offer her a reprieve, but today, the comfort of the skies would soon be shattered. A few rows ahead, an unassuming man sat alone, absorbed in his tablet. His gray polo shirt and dark slacks screamed understated wealth. His face was etched with the kind of weariness that spoke of late nights and long days. Someone who had seen too much, but had no intention of sharing any of it. His features, lined with age, made him seem like a man who'd long passed his prime. But no one could have predicted the story that was about to unfold around him. It started with a cough. The dry, raspy bark echoed through the cabin, drawing Aisha's eyes from the window. At first it seemed insignificant, a common irritation, nothing more. But then another cough, this one wetter, deeper. Aisha watched as the man shifted in his seat, his face contorting with confusion. He reached for his bottle of water, but his hand trembled, spilling a few drops across his lap. The movement was sluggish now, uncoordinated. Panic flickered across his face. He attempted to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him, and he slumped back into his seat. His breath quickened, erratic and desperate, his mouth parting as if to speak, but no words came. And then, silence. Aisha felt a chill spread through the cabin. The flight attendants' practiced smiles faltered, their steps now quickening as they rushed toward the man. The passengers began to murmur, eyes darting from one row to the next. But it was the look on his face, the sheer terror, the raw panic, that gripped Aisha's chest. She didn't know him. She had no reason to feel connected to him. But in this moment, as his breathing became more labored and his color drained from his face, a powerful instinct kicked in. Something was terribly wrong. And before Aisha could even think, the words that would seal their fate came over the intercom. Is there a doctor on board? Aisha sat in the dim cabin, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the window. The world outside was a blur of fleeting clouds, a fleeting reminder of a life she used to see in full color. Now, everything felt muted, as if the sky itself shared in her grief. For months, she had been living in a fog, moving from one day to the next, not truly living, but simply existing. She blinked away the burning in her eyes, the familiar ache that had been there since the day Marcus, her husband, had been taken from her. 8 months. 8 months since Marcus had been ripped from their lives. Not in the violent chaos of war, where she could at least understand the violence of it all, but in the sterile, impersonal quiet of a training exercise. A freak accident. A malfunction. A 1 in a million failure. The report had said all of that, in cold, clinical terms. But those words didn't carry the weight of the emptiness that had followed. Nothing could. The crash of her husband's death had shattered their family in ways that were too painful to explain. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her, leaving her to scramble for something, anything, to hold on to. But no matter how hard she reached, nothing would ever replace Marcus. Nothing could. "Mom, are you okay?" Aisha turned her head, slowly to face her daughter Lena. The concern in her large brown eyes was too much for Aisha to bear. At 9, Lena had already learned the heavy burden of worrying for her mother. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to be the child comforting the parent, the innocent one shouldering the weight of an adult's grief. Lena's sketchbook was open on her lap, her fingers hovering above a half-finished drawing of a superhero, a character she had created in vivid, intricate detail. Aisha admired the way her daughter's imagination had flourished, despite everything. But the pain in Lena's eyes told Aisha everything she needed to know. Her daughter wasn't as innocent as she should be. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired," Aisha replied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The words came out strained, fragile, as though they were made of glass. "You're doing the face again," Lena said softly. The way her daughter spoke, as if she were speaking to an adult, made Aisha's heart clench. Lena had learned to see through the facade, the sad face, as she called it. Aisha had become an expert at hiding her grief, but Lena, with her perceptive eyes, saw right through her. Aisha forced her lips into a smile, though it felt like she was cracking on the inside. "It's nothing, just thinking about ... things." Lena didn't push it. Instead, she went back to her drawing, her concentration evident. But Aisha knew better. She knew her daughter was holding on to things she wasn't ready to understand. And the longer Aisha stayed lost in her thoughts, the more she worried that Lena would carry this weight for years to come. Across the aisle, Jamal sat slouched in his seat, his eyes locked onto his phone, his headphones securely in place. Aisha knew better than to interrupt him. Jamal was a closed book these days, his grief buried behind layers of teenage angst and indifference. He hadn't spoken much since Marcus's death. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he didn't know how to care anymore. The walls around him had grown so high, so impenetrable, that Aisha often wondered if she would ever be able to reach him again. It tore at her, not being able to help Jamal. He had been Marcus's shadow. They were two peas in a pod, so much alike, so connected. Aisha couldn't help but wonder if, in losing Marcus, Jamal had lost something of himself, too. She tried to talk to him, tried to reach him, but the distance between them grew with every silent moment. She was his mother, but she felt like a stranger. The trip to San Diego was supposed to be a fresh start, a change of scenery, a chance to breathe in air that wasn't thick with the smell of memories, where the neighbors wouldn't glance at them with pity, where Jamal could maybe start to find himself again. But it had become something else, a pilgrimage to Marcus's dream. Marcus had always talked about retiring in San Diego, about the sun, the sea, and the freedom that came with it. It was supposed to be his new life, his next chapter. But now, it was theirs. A bittersweet homage to the man who would never get the chance to turn the page. Aisha's gaze drifted to her hands. Her wedding ring was still there, gleaming in the soft cabin light, a reminder of a life she would never get back. Her PhD was in cellular biology. She had spent years studying the mechanics of life at a molecular level. Krebs cycles, mitochondrial DNA, the intricate processes that governed every living thing. But none of that knowledge had prepared her for this. None of it had prepared her for the loss of the man who had been her partner, her equal, the father of her children. She wasn't a doctor, she was a teacher, a mother, a widow, and all she could do was keep moving, keep pretending that somehow, with each day, the world was going to get better. But in her heart, she knew the truth. It wouldn't, not until she learned how to live without him. The calm of the flight shattered without warning. It started small, just a cough. A single, dry bark that pierced the quiet hum of the cabin. Aisha didn't think much of it at first. Everyone had their moments of discomfort on flights. The air pressure, the food, the recycled air. She was used to it. But then came another cough, and another. This one deeper, wetter. The sound wasn't just a random cough. It was a cry for help. One that no one in the cabin had anticipated. Aisha's eyes snapped toward the source of the noise. She didn't recognize the man at first. He sat a few rows ahead, isolated in his seat, his face partially hidden by the screen of his tablet. He wasn't drawing attention to himself, but now, there was something about him that caught her attention. He was struggling, not just coughing, but shifting uncomfortably in his seat. his hand shaking as he reached for his bottle of water. He looked confused, disoriented. His grip on the bottle was clumsy, uncoordinated. Aisha watched, instinct telling her that something was wrong. She was a biology teacher, not a doctor. Her knowledge of human anatomy was limited to what she taught her students. But in this moment, she felt the stirrings of something deeper, something more primal, the kind of feeling that only comes when danger is near. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, her attention locked onto the man. He fumbled with the bottle cap, his movements jerky. A few drops spilled across his lap as his hand spasmed. The color drained from his face, turning an alarming shade of red. His breath became labored, a sharp rasp escaping his lips. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled, sending him slumping back into his seat. A low murmur spread through the cabin. Passengers looking up from their screens, conversations halting. Aisha's heartbeat quickened, her focus narrowing. The man's face had contorted with panic now, his mouth opening, his eyes darting around the cabin, searching for help. But no one moved. The flight attendants hadn't noticed yet, too preoccupied with their own duties. Mom, Mom. Lena's trembling voice broke through the haze of panic in Aisha's mind. She turned to see her daughters wide, frightened, eyes fixed on the man. Aisha's stomach tightened as she followed Lena's gaze. That man? He can't breathe, Lena whispered, her voice barely audible, but full of terror. Aisha's blood ran cold. She instinctively gripped the armrest, her knuckles white. She hadn't missed the urgency in her daughter's words. The man's breathing was worse now, ragged, frantic. His chest heaved with every breath, each one more desperate than the last. Is everything okay? Jamal asked, pulling off his headphones and glancing at Aisha, his teenage face contorted with confusion. He followed her line of sight, his expression shifting from indifference to unease. But Aisha didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, every ounce of attention focused on the man who was now clutching at his chest, his fingers twitching spasmodically. There was no time to think. Every second that passed made the situation worse. Can I help him? Lena asked, her voice shaking. Aisha didn't know what to say. Her training had been limited to first aid courses, CPR refresher classes. She'll really save him? Could she risk it, with so little experience in a high-pressure situation like this? Her thoughts were interrupted by a shrill voice. One of the flight attendants had finally noticed. Is everything all right, sir? The attendant was standing by the aisle, her smile forced, but it faltered when she saw the man's panicked expression. She rushed forward, but her footsteps faltered, the reality of the situation dawning on her as the man slumped further back in his seat. Sir, can you hear me? The flight attendant's voice was tight with panic, the words falling over themselves as she stepped closer, her face palling. The man didn't respond. His body trembled, his lips turning a bluish hue as his eyes rolled back in his head. His breath came in strangled gasps, his hand grasping at the air in front of him, as if trying to hold on to something, anything. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her own ears. She had to do something. There was no one else. The flight attendants were frozen, unsure of what to do, their training clearly inadequate for the gravity of the situation. The cabin had gone silent now, the hum of the engines the only sound in the air. A hush fell over the passengers as they began to understand the severity of the crisis unfolding before them. The flight attendant grabbed the intercom, her voice strained as she spoke. Is there a doctor on board? We have a medical emergency in row 12. Aisha's stomach twisted. She glanced at her children, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Jamal's earlier indifference had disappeared, replaced by the same raw terror that filled Aisha's chest. Lena, her small hands clutched tightly in her lap, was looking at her mother with a desperate need for reassurance. But there was no reassurance to be given. Aisha didn't have time to comfort them, not now. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin on her, waiting for someone to take control, someone to make the decision, and for a moment, Aisha froze. The overwhelming fear of making the wrong choice, of not being enough, threatened to paralyze her. Then she heard it, Marcus's voice, as clear as if he were standing right next to her. "You don't run from the fire, Aisha. You run toward it." She inhaled sharply, steadying herself, as her husband's words cut through her panic. She had to act. For him, for her children, for this man, who was a stranger, but still human, still in need. She unbuckled her seatbelt, the click of the latch echoing loudly in the silence that had settled over the cabin. "Stay here with Lena," Aisha said, her voice steadier than she felt, the words coming out like a command, more for herself than anyone else. "It's okay. I'm going to help." Her legs felt like lead as she stood, the aisle stretching out before her, each step seeming longer than the last. Every eye in the cabin was on her, their silent expectation pressing down on her like a physical weight. The tightness in her chest was suffocating, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't hesitate. This was her moment. She reached row 12, where the man was now slumped in his seat, his body limp and lifeless, a terrible pallor to his skin. The flight attendants were struggling to keep him upright, but their efforts seemed futile. They needed help. Aisha was the only one who could give it. "Is anyone trained in CPR?" Aisha's voice was calm, but it didn't hide the urgency beneath it. One of the flight attendants, Sarah, turned to her, her eyes filled with a silent plea. "Please, help him." Aisha took a deep breath. This was it. No turning back now. She moved into action. Aisha knelt by the man's side, the cold, sterile air of the cabin pressing against her skin. The once quiet, humdrum flight had become a nightmare. His chest wasn't rising, his lips were blue, and his face, once the color of health, was now a ghostly shade of gray. The weight of the moment crashed down on her, but she refused to let it paralyze her. Her hands, though shaking, were steady in purpose. For a split second, Aisha closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to center herself. She could feel her children's eyes on her, their silent presence a tether, grounding her in the chaos. She had been in control of every other part of her life, her work, her children, even her grief, but in this moment, she was fighting for another life, and she couldn't afford to falter. The flight attendants were trying to clear the area, shuffling awkwardly around Aisha, unsure of what to do next. Sarah, the younger attendant, was pacing back and forth, her hands wringing nervously. David, the senior attendant, was trying to assist, but his face betrayed his uncertainty. Neither of them had the medical training required to handle this. They were helpless in the face of what was happening. Aisha's mind flashed back to Marcus. She could see him, clear as day, in their kitchen, holding a medical manual in one hand and explaining CPR to her, as Lena and Jamal sat wide-eyed at the table. He had always been the one to take the lead in their home, the rock in their family. His calm presence had been their anchor. His knowledge of medical emergencies, a safety net they all relied on. "You don't hesitate, Aisha," Marcus had said, his voice steady and warm. "In a moment like this, you just act. You have to trust what you know. You have to trust yourself." The memory of Marcus's voice was like a light in the dark, cutting through her anxiety and pulling her into focus. She had been trained for this, not in the heat of battle, not in the chaos of a foreign conflict, but in the sterile, safe classrooms of a CPR course. That training had felt abstract, distant, but now it was real. The life of a man was in her hands, and she would not let him slip away. Her hands moved with practiced precision. She placed her fingers on his carotid artery, her heart beating faster with every second that passed without a pulse. The man's body felt cold and unresponsive under her touch. She held her breath. Nothing. No pulse. She could feel the cold fear creeping up her spine, but she shoved it down. "Mom," Lena's voice whispered, small but insistent. her hand resting on Aisha's shoulder. Aisha didn't have to look at her daughter to know she was scared. Lena had seen death before, but this was different. This was real. Is he going to be okay? Aisha's throat tightened as she tried to swallow the lump that formed there. She forced her voice to remain steady. Sweetheart, I need you to stay back and be brave. Okay, I need to focus. Lena nodded, her face tight with fear, but Aisha could see the bravery there too. Her daughter had inherited her strength. Aisha's mind was no longer in the present moment. It was in a blur of instructions, muscle memory, and the echoes of Marcus's voice. Tilt the head, lift the chin. She opened his mouth, checking for any obstructions. Nothing. Airways. Clear. Can you get me a timer? Aisha called to Jamal, her voice sharp but urgent. She couldn't afford to waste a second. Jamal didn't hesitate. His phone was out, his fingers swiping furiously as he set the timer. His eyes were focused, every inch of his teenage defiance replaced by something else. Determination, purpose. He wasn't the angry, quiet teen anymore. He was her partner, her team. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him so focused, so present. And in that moment, he reminded her so much of Marcus.com, unshakable, with a quiet strength that she hadn't expected to find in him. The first compression was hard, almost painful. Aisha's hands sank into his chest with a force she hadn't realized she had. The muscles in her arms screamed with the effort, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't pause. Not now. His life depended on it. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted, her voice steady, rhythmic. The sound of her voice, the familiar beat of the numbers, brought her back to the CPR classes, the uncomfortable plastic mannequins, the cold artificial pressure of the practice dummies. But this wasn't a dummy. This was real. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she pushed harder, faster, following the rhythm she'd been taught. The numbers echoed in her mind, the pulse of life pulsing through her hands as they pressed into his chest, over and over. She could feel the burn in her arms, the strain in her back, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Stay focused. She murmured to herself, her words blending with the sound of the engines, the voices around her, the rush of blood in her ears. Keep going, keep going. David was by her side now, holding an AED, his hands moving swiftly. He slapped the defibrillator pads onto the man's chest, working with Aisha to prepare for the shock. Stop compressions, David ordered. It's ready. Aisha's breath was ragged, her chest heaving as she stepped back, her eyes never leaving the man's face. She looked at Jamal, who stood at her side, his phone timer still running, his expression tight with focus. His hand brushed hers, an unspoken gesture of support. The defibrillator's voice filled the cabin, cold and mechanical, analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient. Aisha's body went still as she held her breath. The seconds stretched into eternity. The machine made a soft clicking noise. Then came the voice. Shock advised. Charging. Stand clear. Aisha stepped back. Her hand clutched her daughter's, feeling Lena's tiny fingers trembling, but her grip was firm. She held her daughter's eyes, offering what little strength she had left. David yelled, "Clear," as he stepped back, his hands hovering above the patient's chest. Aisha's hand trembled as she reached forward, hovering over the orange button. This was it, the moment that could make all the difference. She pressed it. The man's body jerked violently off the floor, his chest arching as the electric shock coursed through him. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The sound of the shock, the crackle of the air, the noise of the engines, it all drowned out as the moment hung in the air. The man fell back, his body limp. Aisha's pulse raced, her heart pounding. In her chest, she threw herself back on top of him, resuming compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. She was nothing more than a machine now, her arms working in mechanical rhythm, her mind focused solely on the task ahead. And then, it happened. A flutter, a breath, a faint, ragged gasp of air. Aisha froze. Her heart skipped. She leaned closer, listening to the man's chest. Another breath, this time deeper. His eyelids fluttered, his mouth opening with the struggle to take in air. It wasn't much, but it was something. He's breathing, Sarah gasped, her voice breaking through the tension. He's breathing on his own. Aisha collapsed, back on her heels, her body trembling with exhaustion. She watched as the man's color slowly returned to his face, the blue tinge around his lips fading. He was alive. She had done it. They had done it. Aisha's eyes met her children's. The fear that had consumed them was slowly replaced with relief. Jamal knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, offering the kind of support he never had before. He wasn't just the teenager who shut everyone out. He was her son, her partner in this moment. And Lena, with her wide, innocent eyes, gave her mother a soft smile that spoke volumes of the courage Aisha hadn't known she possessed. They had saved a life together. Aisha stood still in the aisle, her chest heaving as she wiped the sweat from her brow. The chaos of the last few minutes seemed to blur into a surreal haze. Her breath, still ragged, mixed with the low hum of the engines above her head. The man was alive. His chest was rising and falling now, his color returning, the deep blue of his lips fading as the life she had fought for began to settle back into his body. She let out a shaky breath, her body trembling from exhaustion, her hands, slick with sweat, still burned from the compressions, but the weight of the moment was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet relief that she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. Her children, Jamal and Lena, were still by her side, their eyes wide with the shock of what had just transpired. Aisha met their gazes, and for a brief moment, the overwhelming terror she had felt in the air seemed to dissipate. They had done it. Together, they had saved a man's life. The silence that followed the chaos felt almost too loud. The passengers, who had been watching in stunned silence, were now murmuring quietly to one another. A few of them caught Aisha's eyes, offering tentative smiles of gratitude. But Aisha barely noticed them. Her focus was still on the man in front of her, now unconscious but stable. But then, something strange happened. The man, still groggy and disoriented, began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, his gaze was unfocused. Aisha held her breath as his gaze slowly drifted toward her. There was something about the way he looked at her, almost with recognition, but not quite. His eyes were piercing, blue, cold, and calculating, and they locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. I owe you everything." Aisha nodded, but her mind was already racing. There was something about this man, something off, something she couldn't quite place. She had seen his face before, though she couldn't recall where. But before she could dwell on it further, the flight attendant swooped in, taking charge of the situation and assisting with the man's recovery. "Are you all right?" one of the attendants asked, leaning over him. "Can you sit up?" The man nodded weakly, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrest. He seemed to be coming back to life, though he was still pale and breathing. But it was his presence, his calm, controlled demeanor, that unsettled Aisha. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about him that didn't fit the situation. A simple businessman, a random passenger caught in a medical emergency. She was pulled from her thoughts as the man glanced up at her again, his eyes studying her intently. There was something in his expression, something in the way he appraised her, that felt like more than just gratitude. As if he were seeing something she wasn't seeing, something she wasn't meant to know. Just as Aisha opened her mouth to ask him if he was okay, the flight attendants helped him to his feet, guiding him back to his seat. But something in his posture, something in the way he moved, made her pause. He was strong, unshaken. He wasn't acting like someone who had just nearly died. He was composed, controlled, too controlled. One of the flight attendants turned to Aisha, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know who that is?" Aisha's heart skipped a beat. "No," she replied, her voice tense. "Who is he?" The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously toward the man before meeting Aisha's gaze. "That's Arthur Cowington." The name hit Aisha like a punch to the gut. Her mind went blank for a moment as she tried to process the name, the weight of it. Arthur Cowington. She had heard the name before. It was a name associated with power, wealth, influence, a name that appeared in news articles, corporate headlines, and financial reports. He was one of the most well-known CEOs in the country, the founder of Cowington Dynamics, a multi-billion-dollar technology and defense corporation. Aisha's blood ran cold as the pieces clicked into place. The man she had just fought to save, whose life she had just brought back from the brink of death, was no stranger. He wasn't just an unassuming passenger. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world, a titan of industry, a man whose company had billions at its disposal. But what did it mean? What was he doing on a plane like this? Why was he flying with ordinary passengers, traveling incognito? And more importantly, why had his condition seemed so dire? Why had he needed saving in the first place? As if sensing the turmoil in her mind, the flight attendant lowered her voice further. "He's a very private man. No one really knows much about him, but he's kind of a legend in the business world. I've heard rumors about his power, his ruthlessness." She paused, glancing at the man again before leaning closer to Aisha. "And I've also heard that he's been under a lot of stress lately, but I didn't expect... This Aisha's mind reeled. Her hands shook as she wiped them against her jeans, the full weight of the situation starting to settle over her. She had just saved the life of a man who, on the surface, seemed to be a force of nature. But she wasn't sure whether he was a hero or a villain. She had no idea who he really was, what kind of man he had become, and yet, in a way, she had given him something that most people would never get: a second chance, a chance to continue living, to redeem himself in some way. But at what cost? "Thank you," Arthur Cowington said again, his voice barely above a whisper, as he leaned toward her. Once more. This time, there was a different look in his eyes. Something calculating. "You saved my life. I'll never forget that." Aisha nodded, her heart pounding. The words felt hollow to her now. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't thanking her just for saving him. He was thanking her for something more, something deeper. There was a connection between them, but she couldn't figure out what it was. As the flight continued, Aisha kept her distance from the man. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about his company, about everything that had happened in the last few hours. Her mind kept circling back to one question. Who was Arthur Cowington really? Aisha sat on the edge of her seat, the silence in the cabin heavy around her. The plane was still humming, the steady drone of the engines, the only sound breaking through. The tension that had settled in her chest, her heart pounded, a rhythmic reminder of everything that had just happened. The chaotic medical emergency, the man she had fought to save, and now, the crushing weight of his identity. Arthur Cowington. The name echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the images that had started to flood her thoughts. The man she had saved, the wealth and power he commanded, and the deep, painful irony of it all. Arthur Cowington was the CEO of Cowington Dynamics, the company responsible for the faulty equipment that had killed Marcus. The equipment that had stolen her husband from her, left her a widow, and her children without a father. It was a cruel twist of fate, one that made her feel as if the universe were mocking her. Her mind raced. How could she have saved him? How could she have pulled him back from the edge, only to discover that the man she had just saved was connected to her grief in a way she hadn't imagined? She had been so sure of herself when she performed CPR, when she fought for his life. But now, the weight of what she had done felt like an unbearable burden as the flight continued. Aisha found it hard to focus on anything else. Her thoughts kept returning to Arthur, his cold blue eyes, and the unsettling calm with which he had accepted her help. How could he sit there, so composed, when his company's negligence had cost her everything? How could he thank her for saving his life, knowing what his company had done to hers? She had thought, perhaps naively, that by saving him, she was doing the right thing. Then it was just a matter of doing her duty, of acting as a human being, a mother, a person with the ability to make a difference. But now, the layers of moral ambiguity had started to peel away, leaving her with a question that had no easy answer. Justice or vengeance? The word vengeance clung to her like a shadow, a whisper that began to grow louder with each passing minute. What if she didn't stop at saving his life? What if she made him pay? What if she could use his guilt, his debt, to her as leverage? What if, instead of accepting his gratitude, she demanded something more, something that would make him truly feel the weight of what he had taken from her? The idea of revenge was seductive. It was the kind of temptation that anyone in her position might have succumbed to. The thought of seeing Arthur Cowington brought down, of seeing his empire crumble, of making him pay for the death of her husband, it felt almost just her anger, her pain, all of it began to fuel that dark desire for retribution. She had the power now, didn't she? She had saved his life, and he owed her. He owed her more than gratitude. He owed her justice. But then came the voice that had been with her all along, the voice of Marcus, steady and clear, just as it had been when they had first met. Aisha, don't let your anger control you. Don't let it consume you. Justice is not about revenge. It's about what's right, what's fair. Don't lose yourself in the darkness. Aisha squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice of her husband. She could still hear him so clearly, as if he were sitting beside her. He had always been the moral compass in their relationship, the one who kept her grounded when the world threatened to swallow her whole. His words had always been a source of strength, but now they felt like a weight. His absence made the choice between justice and vengeance feel unbearable. What was she supposed to do? She had lost everything because of Cowington dynamics, her husband, her sense of safety, her family's stability. And now, the man whose company had caused all of that was sitting just a few rows away, alive because of her. Was this some kind of cosmic joke? Her heart ached as the truth began to settle in. Saving Arthur's life didn't change the past. It didn't bring Marcus back. It didn't fill the empty space beside her in their bed, or heal the broken pieces of her children's hearts. It didn't erase the pain of seeing her daughter cry for a father she would never truly know, or the way Jamal had shut down, closing himself off from the world as he struggled to cope with his grief. Aisha looked at her children, both of them now quietly sitting in their seats, their eyes lost in their own thoughts. Lena was drawing again, her pen moving quickly across the page, her colorful superheroes taking shape in a way that reminded Aisha of Marcus. Jamal, on the other hand, stared out the window, the reflection of his face, a mask of anger and pain. This was about more than just Arthur. This was about them, about her family, about the legacy she wanted to leave behind for her children, and it wasn't about tearing down the world to get back at the people who had hurt them. It was about building something better, something that Marcus would have wanted, something that would make their loss matter. Aisha's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She had been avoiding it for days, the thought of seeing messages or calls from people who had no idea what she was going through. But now, in the quiet of her own thoughts, she realized that it wasn't just about confronting Arthur. It was about confronting herself. She pulled up the contact for Chloe, Marcus's sister, and hesitated for a moment before hitting call. The phone rang once, twice, and then Chloe's voice filled the air, calm and steady as always. Aisha, hey, you okay? Aisha blinked back tears, her voice cracking as she spoke. I don't know, Chloe. I don't know what to do anymore. Chloe's voice softened, a hint of understanding in it. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one step at a time. But Aisha knew that wasn't true. She couldn't take this one step at a time. This was a decision that would define everything moving forward. Justice or vengeance. Right or wrong, she had saved Arthur Covington's life. But was she willing to let the past consume her in the process? Was she going to allow the pain of her loss to push her down a path that would ultimately destroy everything she was trying to rebuild? The intercom crackled above her. The pilot's voice came through, calm and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our destination. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for descent. The words felt like a finality, a reminder that, no matter what choices she made, life would keep moving. Time would keep ticking. Her children were growing, her grief was morphing, and the man who had caused her family's pain was still sitting just a few rows away. Alive because of her, Aisha took a deep breath and made her decision. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But she wasn't going to let revenge control her. She wasn't going to let it consume her or her children. Marcus wouldn't have wanted that. She had saved Arthur's life. But the real battle was yet to come. She would confront him, not for vengeance, but for justice. Not just for herself, but for Marcus, for her children, and for a future where she could live with the choices she had made. Aisha had thought she would feel stronger, more in control, when the time came to confront Arthur. She had imagined the moment 1,000 times. Standing face to face with the man whose company's negligence had taken her husband's life. Demanding answers, demanding accountability. She had imagined the righteous fury that would fuel her words, the sense of empowerment that would follow. But as the time drew closer, the moment felt less like a battle and more like a reckoning. The decision had been made. There would be no revenge, no easy path of retribution. Marcus's voice, steady and clear in her memory, had guided her. Justice, not vengeance. She had chosen the hard path, the one that aligned with her values, with Marcus's values, and now, standing in the sterile conference room of the hotel in San Diego, Aisha realized the weight of that decision. It wasn't just about confronting Arthur Covington, it was about confronting herself. About finding peace in her choices, knowing that whatever happened next, she had stayed true to the person she wanted to be. Arthur was sitting across from her at the table, his demeanor calm, almost too calm. He wasn't the man who had been wheeled off the plane in an oxygen mask. He wasn't the terrified passenger gasping for breath. He was the CEO again, composed, controlled, unshaken. He had recovered from his medical emergency, and now he was prepared to face the woman who had saved his life. Aisha's heart thudded in her chest as she looked at him. He had already thanked her, already expressed his gratitude, but it all felt hollow to her now. The man who had been so grateful, so apologetic, when he was at death's door, seemed like a different person. The moment his identity had been revealed, Arthur Covington, the titan of industry, she knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. This wasn't going to be a simple thank you and a handshake. Arthur leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on her. His eyes were calculating, as though he were appraising her, trying to read her every move. He knew why she had asked to meet with him. He knew the stakes. "I can never repay you for what you did," Arthur said, his voice low and measured. "But I need to know how I can make this right." Aisha felt a flash of bitterness rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She had already decided what needed to happen, but hearing the words spoken so casually, so smoothly, made her stomach turn. Make it right. How could he even fathom the depth of her loss, the pain that had been caused by his company's reckless pursuit of profit over human life? "You want to make it right." Aisha's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that had been buried deep within her, waiting for this moment. She leaned forward, meeting Arthur's gaze. "You can start by acknowledging What your company did. Acknowledge that it wasn't a freak accident. It was a failure. Your failure. Arthur's brow furrowed, and for the first time, Aisha saw a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. I didn't know. No, Aisha interrupted, her voice cutting through the air. You didn't know, but your company did. A piece of faulty equipment, the R7 relay system. It killed my husband. It stole him from me. It stole him from my children. And you're sitting here, asking how you can make it right. Her voice trembled with restrained emotion. You don't get to make it right. You can't bring him back. You can't undo what your company did. She paused, taking a slow, measured breath. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her emotions in check. The anger was there, raw and pulsing. But beneath it was something deeper, something more profound. Grief. The grief of a woman who had lost the love of her life, and who was now faced with the man whose empire had caused that loss. Arthur was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. He looked at her, really looked at her, and Aisha saw something shift in his gaze. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of realization, a shift from arrogance to something more, human. Something closer to guilt. I never wanted this, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I don't know how to make up for what's happened. But I can't just walk away from this, Aisha. I can't pretend like it didn't happen. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She hadn't expected this. She had expected deflection, excuses, maybe even anger or defensiveness. But instead, Arthur Coington was admitting the truth. He was acknowledging the part he played, whether directly or indirectly, in the loss she had suffered. Aisha closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of it all crashing down on her. The anger, the grief, the confusion, it all felt too much to carry in this room. But she had to. She had to see this through. For Marcus. For her children. I'm not here for your pity, she said softly, her voice a little quieter now. I'm not here for your money, either. I'm not here to ruin you or make you suffer. But I am here for something else. Arthur's eyes widened slightly, and Aisha could see that he was beginning to understand what she was asking. You want to make it right, she continued, her voice gaining strength again. Then you'll do something meaningful. You'll do something that matters. Not for you, not for your company, but for the people who are still suffering because of your company's mistakes. Aisha stood up and walked around the table, pausing for a moment to collect herself before she spoke again. I want you to fund a complete overhaul of the equipment safety standards in your industry. I want you to establish independent oversight for all military contracts. And I want your company to start investing in the communities that have been affected by the kind of negligence that killed my husband. She turned to look him in the eye, and I want the Southside Youth Hub in Chicago to be your first major project. If you want to make this right, you will take the money you're offering me, and you'll give it to that community. To the kids who are growing up without fathers because of the kind of failures your company has made. Arthur was silent for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but Aisha could see the conflict playing across his face. He was weighing the cost of her demands, and she knew this wasn't going to be easy for him. But this wasn't about what was easy. This was about doing the right thing. Finally, he nodded. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was quiet, solemn, but it was enough. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady. I'll make it happen. I'll do everything you've asked. Aisha felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the deep sorrow that still clung to her heart. This wasn't the resolution she had dreamed of. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was justice, restorative justice, not retribution. It wasn't about punishing Arthur. It was about ensuring that something good came from all the pain, that the legacy of Marcus's death would bring about change, not just for her, but for others. She stood there for a moment, looking at Arthur, not with hatred, not with anger, but with something else. It was a kind of clarity, a kind of peace that had been impossible to find until now. "Thank you," Aisha said, her voice steady but quiet. "This is all I needed." Arthur stood, his eyes filled with something that looked like respect, maybe even guilt. But Aisha didn't need him to apologize anymore. She didn't need his gratitude. She needed action. And now, she had it.